The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
On October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater players produced a radio drama based on H.G. Wells's 1898 book, The War of the Worlds. He optimized his knowledge of radio programming and listeners' habits to set the stage for a Halloween hoax playing on the current state of wartime fears still driving American emotion. This dramatic presentation set a precedent for later public media standards. Producers must act responsibly to ensure broadcasts are not mistaken for actual events or emergencies.
Ladies and gentlemen, the director of the Mercury Theater and star of these broadcasts, Orson Welles.
The radio drama took the format of live news feeds and news updates during a musical radio program that made it seem as though an invasion were actually happening in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. In the original script, the Martians were described as invaders and an army. People tuning into the program a few minutes later would have missed the announcements identifying this as a fictional drama set in 1939.
The program aired on the CBS network opposite the very popular NBC radio program, The Chase and Sanborn Hour, the most listened to radio program on Sunday nights. Orson Welles knew most of the listening audience would be tuned into NBC, but might change the station after Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy finished their comedic routine and the musical portion of the program began.
Listeners began tuning into the CBS broadcast after assurances were already made that the program was a fictional account and not a real news broadcast. But for those who tuned in during the middle of the broadcast, they believed the event was real and began to panic.
Dorothy Hetherington Faring was 10 years old and remembers listening to the broadcast with her family in her two-room house in Valley Center, Kansas.
My father had we'd bought a new radio that we hadn't had for years and never had one. And we was listening to the radio and this story came on. And it was telling us about a war that was going on around New York City and around, it was killing people. And my dad, he kept saying, now remember, this is just a story. It isn't the truth. And we were all scared because it was coming every which direction and killing people, and people were running and killing themselves. And it lasted about an hour or so, I think, as much as I can remember. Been through a lot since then. But it was a story that was hard to believe, because if you didn't know at the very beginning that it was just a story, it sounded real.
On the East Coast, people called local police stations and radio stations asking about the Martian invasion. Switchboard operators recalled the hysteria and panic of calls being placed to loved ones during the program.
Our board lit up when they announced that the Martians were coming across the George Washington Bridge. And that's when the excitement started.
Mary Louise Frick was a freshman at Oklahoma A&M College and remembers her friends returning home from their dates scared because of the broadcast.
I would have been at OSU. And I remember it was a Sunday. And I lived in a house with 40 other girls. We were at the Pi-Phi house across the street from Theta Pond. And I remember it was sort of in the evening, and almost everybody had a dinner date with their boyfriend. I thought, well, just let the War of Worlds go ahead. I'm going to be a good time. They began streaming in back to the house from their dates because they had heard about this radio program. Now, I didn't hear it. I heard about it, and I thought, no, I don't care, because I was more interested in the boys. Some of the girls came into the house then, screaming and in a panic, and they had got on the phone and started calling their parents to see if they were okay, all that sort of thing.
The next day, headlines in major U.S. newspapers ran stories about the panic that the program caused.
Angry listeners sent letters to the Federal Communications Commission complaining about the broadcast. One angry listener, Paul Morton, wrote, "I am requesting that you immediately make an investigation and do everything possible to prevent a reoccurrence." He even mentioned that the communications for the police department were paralyzed for 3 hours.
Another man, J.V. Yockey, wrote, "The Mercury Theater has been one of the radio highlights of the week for me this fall. The program Sunday, I felt, was one of their better programs."
Orson Welles, seen here in an Associated Press newsreel on Monday, October 31st, 1938, the day after the broadcast.
Do you think there ought to be a law against such enactments as we had last night as a result of that?
I don't know what the legislation would be. I know that almost everybody in radio would do almost anything to avert the kind of thing that has happened, myself included, but I don't know what the legislation would be. Radio is new and we are learning about the effect it has on people.
How could anyone believe anything this absurd so easily? Why did this radio program create such a panic? Orson Welles quite possibly timed the programming announcements in order to gain the most reaction from the audience.
The months preceding October 1938 were a tense time in world geopolitical relations. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power and began their atrocities against the Jewish population. Austria was annexed by Germany. The Munich Agreement took the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia and gave it to Germany for peace in our time. Japan invaded China. Spain was embroiled in a civil war. A hurricane devastated New England, killing hundreds of people.
When viewed with appropriate historical context, one can easily imagine why people may have made assumptions. It was an ingeniously disguised attack from European troops.
The Mercury Theater performance of The War of the Worlds inadvertently caught a portion of the listening audience unaware. Radio was a rapidly developing technology and was in about 12 million homes at the time of the broadcast. Broadcasting false information was obviously against the FCC regulations, but this was a radio drama and not a real event. The public was told at the beginning of the broadcast, and then reminded again during the broadcast, that it was a dramatic presentation of the War of the Worlds. Orson Welles created a radio program based on a book people would have been familiar with, but he used timing, dramatic suspense, and the public's own fears to create the perfect Halloween prank.
The Federal Communications Commission, under orders from Congress, held hearings and determined that no laws were broken by the broadcast. Subsequent changes to the rules in Section 73.1217 of the FCC rules relating to hoaxes and false news stories reflect these differences.
The War of the Worlds broadcast is one of the most recognized radio broadcasts in media history. It represents the public media standards in a way that no broadcast has ever done before. While some listeners may have thought they were being invaded, Welles did not have or need an army to back up his presentation. He accidentally terrorized an entire nation with his words alone.
We lived out in the country and didn't go to town very often, about once a week. But when Daddy brought home a newspaper, well, they didn't have the whole story. Then we saw what was happening that way. It was scary. Yeah, I wouldn't want to live through it again.
So goodbye, everybody, and remember, please, for the next day or so, the terrible lesson you learned tonight. That grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch, and if your doorbell rings and nobody's there, that was no Martian, it's Halloween.